Anna Whitmore had never considered herself a woman of noise or spectacle, and for most of her life she had lived in spaces that were never truly her own. Small apartments rented with strict rules, narrow hallways shared with neighbors who shouted too, loudly, or cooked food that seeped through the walls, places where she always felt like a temporary guest waiting for the next lease to expire. The house she now lived in was different. It was the only place that had ever felt permanent, and every inch of it carried the weight of memory. Years ago, her husband, Daniel, an architect with a quiet brilliance, had drawn the first sketches for the porch that wrapped around the front of the house. He had spoken of proportion and light, of how the angle of the railing should let the morning sun stretch across the floorboards just so, how the columns should not feel ornamental but supportive, as if they too were guardians of the life that would unfold on that veranda. He had passed away 3 years earlier, and though the absence of his voice still settled in the house like a shadow that never quite lifted, Anna found comfort in the small rituals of her mornings. She would rise early, grind coffee beans by hand, and carry her mug to the porch where she sat in the old wicker chair, its paint chipped from weather but still sturdy, and she would let the silence of dawn wrap around her. To outsiders it was only a porch, a few boards nailed together with a railing and a roof, but to Anna it was the place where Daniel still lingered, in the drawings framed in her study, in the memories of evenings spent discussing books and plans, in the way the floor creaked in the exact spot where his weight had once leaned. The street itself was not remarkable. Lined with modest homes, lawns trimmed with varying degrees of care, neighbors who exchanged polite greetings but rarely much more. Anna was content with that. She was not unfriendly, only private, preferring a quiet nod over endless conversation. She had never imagined that her desire for peace would make her vulnerable, but vulnerability, she learned, often appeared in the most absurd forms. The first sign of intrusion was so bizarre that for a moment she thought she was still dreaming. One cool April morning she stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in her hands, and stopped dead in her tracks. Her chair had been pushed to the side, replaced by a small fold-out table draped with a cloth, and beside it stood 2 mismatched stools. On the railing, balanced with surprising confidence, was a chalkboard easel scrawled with the words, "Coffee by Karen, $2 a cup." Beneath it sat a neat row of thermoses and paper cups, the kind used at church events or school fundraisers. And behind the makeshift counter stood her neighbor Karen, smiling with an energy that bordered on manic, as if this entire absurdity were the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning, Anna," Karen chirped, waving a gloved hand while pouring steaming liquid into a paper cup for a passerby. "You don't mind, do you? The porch has such charm, it would be a shame not to share it." Anna blinked, words momentarily failing her. She could hear the faint clink of coins as the man paid and walked off with his cup, nodding politely to Karen but not even glancing at Anna, as though she were invisible in her own home. Karen was already turning to greet another neighbor who approached with curiosity, lifting the lid of a thermos and inhaling the aroma with exaggerated delight. Anna felt her pulse quicken, the sharp burn of disbelief rising through her chest. She wanted to shout, to demand what Karen thought she was doing, but instead she stood frozen, as though the very foundation of her world had tilted underfoot. The porch had always been hers, intimate and sacred, and now it had been transformed overnight into a stage for someone else's performance, a marketplace she had never agreed to host. She glanced down at the chalkboard sign again, at the cheerful loops of handwriting declaring her sanctuary to be a business, and a wave of anger mixed with grief swept through her. It was not simply a question of trespassing or rudeness. It was as if Karen had reached into the past, taken something that belonged to Anna and Daniel alone, and repackaged it for public consumption. She gripped her coffee cup tighter, heat searing into her palms, and finally found her voice, low and strained. "Karen, what is this?" But Karen only laughed as if the question itself were silly, and motioned toward the porch railing crowded now. with 2 more customers waiting for service. "It's community, Anna," she said, her smile unwavering. "You'll see. It'll be good for everyone." Anna had always believed that absurdity revealed itself quickly, like a bad joke delivered at the wrong moment. But what unsettled her most about the days that followed was how normal everything began to seem to those around her. The first morning had left her stunned, her breath caught between outrage and disbelief. Yet by the end of the week, the sight of Karen bustling on her porch with thermoses, cups, and jars of sugar had become so commonplace to neighbors passing by that they greeted her as though she were running a long-established cafe. Anna would stand inside behind her curtains, watching as men in work boots stopped to buy coffee on their way to construction sites, as mothers pushing strollers paused to chat while Karen served them pastries she had begun bringing in a tin, and as teenagers, laughing too loudly, perched themselves on the railing Daniel had designed with such precision, their shoes scuffing wood that had once been polished with care. Each exchange felt like a blade pressed into Anna's skin, and yet when she stepped outside to confront Karen, the woman's smile was so confident and her tone so condescendingly sweet that Anna found herself struggling to assert what should have been self-evident, that the porch was hers, private, and not some community square. One afternoon, gathering what she thought would be the strength to end the charade once and for all, Anna walked onto the porch and announced firmly that she wanted everything removed, immediately. Karen, mid-pour, barely paused. She looked up with that same smile, her eyes glinting with a satisfaction that made Anna's stomach twist, and said loudly enough for the customers to hear, "Oh, Anna, I thought you supported neighborhood initiatives. We're all trying to bring life back to this street. Isn't it better than an empty porch collecting dust?" The comment earned sympathetic nods from the bystanders, and Anna felt the humiliation sink deep, for she realized Karen was not only trespassing but framing Anna as the unreasonable one. When the last customer left, Anna lowered her voice and demanded Karen pack up. Karen finally leaned closer, her smile flattening into something sharper, and whispered, "You don't understand, Anna. This porch isn't entirely yours. There are old agreements, records you've clearly forgotten. You might want to be careful before making claims you can't back up." The words landed like stones, heavy with menace. Anna wanted to dismiss them, but there was a tone of certainty that lodged itself in her chest. That night she sat at the dining table with Daniel's files spread out before her. Blueprints, permits, correspondence, all of which clearly marked the porch as private property. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and doubt grew quickly in the soil of grief and isolation. 2 days later, her fears were confirmed when an official envelope appeared in her mailbox. Inside was a notice of legal action filed by Karen Whitmore of the adjacent property, claiming shared rights to Anna's porch based on a historic easement tied to neighborhood use. Anna read the words again and again, her heart racing, because alongside the typed text was a photocopy of what appeared to be a decades-old document bearing Daniel's signature. It looked genuine at first glance, but the ink seemed too uniform, the lines of the signature too practiced, and Anna, who had watched her husband sign countless papers, knew in her bones it was wrong. The realization chilled her. Not only was Karen trespassing, she was using Daniel's memory as a weapon, parading a forgery as truth. Still, the absurdity did not end there. Karen began speaking to neighbors in tones of martyrdom, describing Anna as selfish, unwilling to allow the community to enjoy what had always been a shared space. At first, Anna thought no one would believe such a transparent lie, but one evening, as she took out her trash, a man across the street remarked that he hoped she and Karen could work something out, as if the dispute were no different from a quarrel over hedges or noise. Another neighbor mentioned that Karen was doing something nice for the area, and wondered aloud why Anna was so against it. Each comment was like a subtle erasure of her truth, and she felt herself being painted into the role of antagonist in her own life. What shook her most, however, was the realization that Karen was escalating deliberately. One morning, Anna opened her door to find not only the usual table and chairs but also laminated menus taped to the porch columns, advertising lattes, teas, and muffins. A small tip jar rattled with coins and bills, evidence that people were paying real money for the occupation of her home. The brazenness stole Anna's breath, and when she tried once again to protest, Karen only widened her smile and said, "If you block me, Anna, you'll be the one facing consequences. I've already documented your hostility. The law will side with me. You'll see." There was a kind of madness in her certainty, a theatrical confidence that left Anna momentarily doubting her own reality. The true breaking point came late on a Saturday morning. Anna returned from a grocery trip, her arms heavy with bags, only to find three strangers sitting comfortably on her porch, sipping coffee and chatting as though in a public cafe. One of them even moved aside politely to let her pass, muttering thanks as though she were staff rather than the owner. Anna forced herself through them, her face burning, and once inside she set down her groceries and collapsed into a chair, trembling. She realized then that Karen had achieved something far worse than simple trespass. She had inverted the truth so thoroughly that others now treated Anna as an intruder in her own home. That night, Anna barely slept. She moved through the rooms with a restless energy, touching the walls Daniel had built, the furniture they had chosen together, the blueprints still rolled on a shelf. Each memory whispered of belonging, of permanence, of the sanctuary they had created, and yet Karen's presence on the porch, loud and false, was rewriting those memories with every passing day, replacing intimacy with spectacle, devotion with exploitation. When dawn finally broke, Anna sat on the porch alone, the thermoses gone for once, the air still, and she made herself a quiet promise. Whatever documents Karen produced, whatever lies she spread, however absurd the battle became, Anna would not allow Daniel's legacy or her own sanctuary to be stolen. She did not yet know how she would fight, but she knew the fight had already begun. When the official letter of summons arrived, printed on cream paper with the county seal pressed sharply into its corner, Anna felt a strange disorientation, as if the world had shifted into a version of itself that no longer obeyed logic. The summons named her directly, listing her full address and declaring her as the defendant in a civil claim regarding shared right of use of her front porch. Reading those words was like being dropped into a play she had never auditioned for, the absurdity so complete it bordered on grotesque. Karen had not merely threatened to go to court, she had gone through with it, filing documents that asserted her business venture was legally protected by historical easement, that Anna's attempts to remove her were acts of harassment, and that Karen had suffered financial damages from Anna's so-called interference with her customers. Anna's throat tightened as she traced the bolded line in the document. Plaintiff seeks restitution for lost revenue and assurance of continued access to property. Restitution, continued access, words that transformed her private sanctuary into contested ground. For hours she sat in her living room with the papers spread across the table, her hands trembling too much to hold a pen as she tried to make sense of the legal jargon. She remembered Daniel's calm voice during past disagreements with contractors, how he would parse out every clause with patient logic, and she wished with a deep ache that he could be here to explain what was happening now. But he was not, and she was left with the silence of the house and the gnawing knowledge that Karen had maneuvered her into a place where every step forward would require energy, money, and time that Anna had never anticipated needing to spend. By evening, she made the decision to seek legal help, and though the thought of explaining such an absurd case made her feel almost foolish, she called the number of a law firm a colleague of Daniel's had once mentioned. The following week, she found herself seated across from Martin Ellis, a man with silver hair and tired eyes who had clearly seen stranger disputes than hers, though he did not show it in mockery. Instead, he listened carefully, his fingers steepled as she described the transformation of her porch, the coffee stand, the false documents, and the lawsuit. When she handed him the photocopy Karen had filed, he adjusted his glasses and studied it for a long moment before shaking his head. "It's not just a forgery, Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly. "It's a clumsy one. This signature was lifted from another document, probably scanned and transposed. Look here, the pressure marks are identical, something that doesn't happen naturally with ink. And the date format is inconsistent with the county's records from that decade. I've seen this trick before." Relief flickered through Anna, but it was quickly tempered by dread. If the forgery was so obvious, why had the court accepted it enough to summon her? Martin seemed to anticipate the thought. The courts don't examine authenticity until trial. Anyone can file almost anything. That's why we'll need to respond quickly and firmly. In the days that followed, Anna's home felt like it had been transformed into a fortress under siege, though the attackers wore friendly faces. Each morning she peered through the curtains and saw Karen arranging her stand with renewed vigor, as though emboldened by the lawsuit. More customers came, drawn not only by coffee but by curiosity about the neighborly cafe at the center of a legal battle. Some lingered longer than before, asking pointed questions of Karen, who answered with theatrical sighs about how hard it was to be punished for simply trying to brighten the community. Anna overheard snippets of conversation carried through open windows, claims that she was wealthy and selfish, that she hated people, that she was trying to crush a small business out of spite. None of it was true, yet the repetition of lies had power, reshaping the way others looked at her when she walked to her mailbox or watered her flowers. The isolation pressed in, more suffocating than silence. One evening, returning home from Martin's office with a folder of documents to prepare her defense, Anna noticed something that chilled her more than Karen's chatter. A group of college students she did not recognize were sprawled across her porch steps, laughing loudly with cups in hand, while Karen leaned against the railing like a hostess welcoming guests. When Anna approached, one of the young men gestured toward her door with mock politeness, saying, "We'll move in a sec, ma'am, don't worry." He said it as though she were the one intruding. She brushed past them, heart pounding, and once inside locked the door with shaking fingers. Later that night, she heard them still outside, their laughter mingling with Karen's voice, and the humiliation cut deep enough to bring tears she had not allowed herself in years. Karen escalated further, not with noise this time, but with subtler tactics. Small pamphlets appeared in neighbors' mailboxes, hand-drawn flyers proclaiming, "Support local, coffee by Karen," now facing unfair opposition. Anna found one tucked into her own fence, the words "unfair opposition" underlined twice as if directed personally at her. She threw it away, but the sting remained. Then came the first truly aggressive act. She woke one morning to find a wooden sign hammered into her lawn, its painted letters declaring, "Coffee Shop Entrance." The audacity made her knees weaken, for the sign had been driven deep into soil. Daniel had once tended, and removing it felt like pulling a thorn from living flesh. She yanked it free, tossed it onto the curb, and for the first time shouted across the yard at Karen to stop. Karen only folded her arms and called back in a voice loud enough for others to hear, "Destroying property won't help your case, Anna. Everyone can see who the aggressor is." It was then Anna realized the extent of Karen's strategy. It was not enough to occupy the porch. Karen wanted to invert reality so completely that Anna would be cast as the trespasser, the unstable neighbor, the one incapable of sharing. She was being painted into a corner, both legally and socially, and each move she made to defend herself was twisted into evidence against her. By the time Anna closed her door that night, pressing her back against it as though to hold the world out, she knew the escalation was no longer a nuisance, but a campaign of control. And control, once seized by someone like Karen, was never surrendered without a fight. Anna had always thought of truth as something solid, a foundation that could not be shaken. But as the weeks passed, she began to realize that truth, when manipulated by determined hands, could be bent and reshaped until even those who once knew her well began to question what they had seen with their own eyes. Each morning she found new signs of Karen's persistence. Another flyer slipped under doors, another conversation overheard where her name was spoken with faint pity or disdain, another stranger seated on her porch sipping from a paper cup as though her home were merely a convenient backdrop for neighborhood theater. She tried to anchor herself in routine, to brew her coffee in the quiet hours before sunrise and sit in the wicker chair Daniel had once favored. But the sound of Karen setting up thermoses and rattling coins made the ritual unbearable. It was as though grief, which she had once learned to carry quietly, had been cracked open again by intrusion and mockery. Her attorney, Martin Ellis, urged her to stay focused on the legal fight, to document everything with precision, to resist emotional outbursts that could be twisted against her. "They thrive on provocation," he said during one of their meetings, his tired eyes kind but firm. "Every time you react, she builds another narrative. Let us dismantle her claims systematically." He explained that a mediation session had been scheduled, a chance for both sides to present their arguments before a neutral moderator in hopes of resolving the dispute without a drawn-out trial. Anna dreaded the thought of sitting across from Karen in a sterile office while strangers judged the legitimacy of her ownership, but she knew she had no choice. She spent nights gathering every scrap of documentation Daniel had left: architectural plans with his seal, mortgage papers signed before a notary, correspondence with county officials regarding permits. Each page felt like an extension of his voice, evidence of the care and precision with which he had built their life. Holding those papers was both comfort and torment. Comfort because she knew the truth was on her side. Torment because she also knew Daniel was not there to defend himself against the grotesque misuse of his name. The day of mediation arrived gray and wet, the sky sagging low as if echoing the heaviness in her chest. Anna walked into the downtown office building with Martin at her side, her steps slow, her hands cold despite gloves. The conference room was brightly lit, sterile, with a long polished table that seemed more suited for corporate negotiations than a battle over a porch. Karen was already there, seated with a lawyer who looked young enough to be her son, his sharp suit and restless tapping pen radiating practiced indifference. Karen herself wore a carefully chosen outfit, a bright floral scarf draped over her shoulders, her smile fixed in a way that suggested she had rehearsed it in the mirror. When Anna entered, Karen leaned forward with theatrical warmth. "Anna," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I'm so glad we can finally sit down like civilized women. This has all gotten so out of hand." Anna did not reply, lowering herself into a chair with deliberate calm. She could feel the weight of Karen's gaze, measuring every movement, every flicker of expression, as though cataloging new ammunition. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a composed demeanor, opened the session by inviting Karen to speak first. Karen launched into her narrative with the ease of a practiced storyteller, describing her so-called community initiative, her love for the neighborhood, and her sorrow at being attacked by what she called an unyielding resistance to progress. She spoke of customers who relied on her coffee stand as a morning ritual, of elderly neighbors who found joy in gathering on the porch, of a spirit of generosity that she claimed Anna was trying to strangle. Her lawyer interjected occasionally, pointing to the supposed easement documents, explaining that the signature of Daniel Whitmore proved consent had once been granted for communal use. Karen even dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, murmuring about how exhausting it was to be vilified for doing good. Anna sat in silence, her fists clenched in her lap, every word like acid in her veins, but she forced herself to remain still to let Martin speak when their turn came. When it did, Martin rose with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with Karen's dramatics. He laid out, one by one, the official documents Anna had preserved: the deed to the property, the architectural plans with county approval stamps, the mortgage records, each of them unambiguous in declaring the porch private property. He then addressed the alleged easement, pointing out irregularities in the format, the use of digital replication inconsistent with documents from that era, and the identical ink flow that suggested copying rather than original signature. "This is not only invalid," he said, tapping the paper lightly, "it is fraudulent." Anna watched the mediator's expression shift subtly, her gaze lingering on the forged document with clear doubt. Relief stirred in her chest, though it was fragile, like a flame in wind. Karen, however, was not deterred. She leaned forward, her voice tightening with indignation, and said, "So, Daniel's signature is being called a forgery now. How convenient. My late husband told me himself that Daniel always wanted this street to be welcoming, that he spoke of opening his porch. Isn't that right, Anna? Don't you remember those conversations?" The words were like a knife twisting in Anna's ribs. Memories rose unbidden of evenings when Daniel and Karen's husband had stood by the fence discussing trivial matters, but never, never had Daniel suggested turning their sanctuary into a public square. She wanted to shout the truth, to scream that Karen was desecrating his memory, but Martin's quiet hand on her arm steadied her. Instead, he spoke firmly. Verbal recollections, even if true, cannot override written, notarized property records. The law is clear. There is no shared right of use. The session stretched for hours, a tug of narratives where truth collided with performance. At times, Anna thought the mediator might end it altogether, especially when Karen presented a petition supposedly signed by neighbors in support of her coffee initiative. The signatures were genuine, but the petition itself was irrelevant too. Property rights. Martin pointed this out with sharp precision, and though Karen's lawyer tried to protest, the mediator finally sighed and said, "The legal evidence weighs strongly on Mrs. Whitmore's side. I encourage you, Ms. Brooks," using Karen's last name, "to reconsider pursuing this claim in court." For the first time, Karen's smile faltered, just slightly, a twitch at the corner of her mouth betraying the steel beneath the sugar. She gathered her papers slowly, eyes fixed on Anna, and in that gaze Anna saw not defeat, but a promise. As the session adjourned, Anna felt a fragile victory forming. She had not crumbled under Karen's performance, and the mediator had all but declared the case baseless. Yet the relief was tempered by the intensity of Karen's stare as she leaned close while leaving, whispering just loud enough for Anna to hear. "You think this is over? You don't know me yet. I always finish what I start." The words slid into Anna's chest like ice. Walking out into the damp air, she wanted to believe the worst was behind her, that logic and evidence had triumphed, but the truth pressed heavily on her. Karen was not walking away. She had tasted the stage and the attention it brought, and Anna knew with the certainty of someone who had weathered grief that the performance was only beginning. That evening, back on her porch, Anna sat alone as the street fell into darkness. The chair creaked beneath her, the scent of wet wood rising from the boards Daniel had once polished. She looked at the space that had become both battlefield and memorial, and though fear still coursed through her veins, another feeling began to stir alongside it. Resolve. Karen might twist stories, forge papers, and rally neighbors with false charm, but Anna carried the truth in every line of Daniel's drawings, in every legal seal on their documents, in every memory that bound the porch to her life. She would not surrender. And yet, as the wind rustled through the night, she could not shake the echo of Karen's words, a warning and a threat, promising that the conflict had only shifted into a darker phase. The fragile sense of reprieve Anna had felt after the mediation dissolved within days, as though the brief acknowledgement of truth in that sterile room had only provoked Karen into tightening her grip and seeking new methods of pressure. At first, it began with whispers from neighbors that Anna could not avoid, muttered fragments she overheard while walking to collect her mail or trimming the roses along her fence. People she had known for years, who had once offered polite greetings and small talk about weather or gardening, now spoke of her as though she had become an enemy of the very community she had quietly supported. One woman remarked with a trace of pity, "It's sad that Anna can't share. She's so isolated," while another muttered, "Karen is at least trying to bring people together." These words stung worse than direct insults because they revealed how thoroughly Karen's narrative had seeped into the fabric of the neighborhood, twisting kindness into suspicion and privacy into selfishness. The escalation did not stop at gossip. Within a week, Anna received a letter from the Homeowners Association, an organization she had always considered little more than a background annoyance that sent newsletters about lawn care and seasonal decorations. The letter, however, was serious in tone, declaring that an official complaint had been filed regarding her property. It accused her of maintaining unauthorized commercial obstruction on her porch, a phrasing so convoluted that it took her several readings to even parse its meaning. Martin explained later that the language was deliberately vague, meant to imply she was interfering with an existing business rather than being the victim of one. The absurdity nearly made her laugh, but the weight of official stationery and the threat of fines that accompanied the notice stripped away any humor. Karen had carried the battle into bureaucracy, exploiting the HOA as another weapon in her arsenal. What unsettled Anna more deeply, however, were the quieter, more insidious acts that began to occur around her home. One morning she stepped outside and found a scattering of paper cups across her porch, each with coffee still pooled inside, sticky trails running down the wood as though someone had deliberately emptied them there. Another evening she returned from a late appointment to see the faint outline of chalk on her walkway, crude arrows pointing toward her porch with the words, "Coffee this way," scrawled on the pavement. Each act was small enough to dismiss as childish, yet the accumulation created a sense of constant violation, a gnawing awareness that she was being targeted not by strangers, but by the very person living a few steps away. She began locking her doors earlier, drawing the curtains before sunset, feeling once again the isolation of widowhood compounded by a hostility she could neither predict nor escape. The most brazen moment arrived on a Sunday morning when she opened her front door to find a laminated poster nailed directly to her porch column. It depicted a cheerful steaming cup with the words, "Coffee by Karen," temporarily closed due to hostility. The implication was unmistakable. Anna herself was now branded as the reason Karen's so-called business suffered, a villain displayed for all to see. She tore the poster down with shaking hands, splinters catching her fingers where the nail had been hammered in, and felt a wave of nausea at the thought of Karen standing there in the night, pounding metal into wood that Daniel had once sanded, smooth with his own hands. For a moment she pressed her palm to the column, as if apologizing to the house itself, and then she carried the poster inside and laid it flat on the table as evidence, a silent reminder of how far Karen's performance had reached. Martin urged her not to retaliate emotionally but to continue gathering proof, and Anna complied, documenting each intrusion with photographs and written notes, though she despised the feeling of turning her home into a case file. Yet, even as she followed his advice, she felt the walls closing in. The HOA began sending follow-up notices requesting inspection, thinly veiled attempts to find fault in her home under the guise of routine checks. Inspectors arrived unannounced, walking up her driveway with clipboards, asking to see her porch and muttering about code compliance. Though Martin intervened and warned them against harassment, the message was clear. Karen had succeeded in mobilizing not just gossip, but administrative machinery against her. The porch no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become contested ground where every board and nail might be scrutinized, judged, or seized upon as justification for further assault. The final straw in this phase came late one night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet. Anna was sitting in the living room, reading documents Martin had given her, when a faint noise drew her attention to the porch. It was the sound of footsteps, hesitant but deliberate, moving across the boards. Her pulse quickened as she set the papers aside and moved to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to peer out. There in the dim light she saw Karen herself, not with thermoses or cups, but with a camera slung around her neck, taking photographs of the porch from multiple angles. She moved with calm purpose, snapping shots of the railing, the columns, the steps, as though cataloging evidence for some unseen audience. When Anna opened the door sharply, demanding to know what she was doing, Karen looked up with a smile too wide to be real and said, "Just documenting, Anna. You never know when proof will be needed. Courts like details." Then, without waiting for a reply, she walked away into the night, her footsteps fading but her words lingering like a cold draft through the house. That night Anna lay awake, unable to close her eyes, the echo of the camera shutter replaying in her mind. She realized that Karen had moved beyond provocation and into calculated intimidation, seeking not merely to annoy but to destabilize, to erode her confidence until she either surrendered or made a mistake that could be used against her. The escalation was no longer about coffee or neighbors. It had become a battle of narratives, of who would be believed when truth itself was bent. As dawn crept into the room, Anna sat up and whispered into the stillness that she would not break, though her voice trembled with exhaustion. She had faced loss before, but this was a different kind of grief, the slow theft of belonging, the erasure of certainty, and it demanded a resolve she was only beginning to summon. She did not yet know how the war would end, but she knew the porch could not fall, not while it still held Daniel's memory, not while it was still hers to defend. The courtroom was smaller than Anna had imagined, the kind of place that looked more like an office conference room hastily converted for hearings than the grand spaces she had seen on television. Yet, despite its modest size, the weight of what would be decided there pressed on her chest with a heaviness that made each breath difficult. She sat at the defendant's table beside Martin, hands clasped in her lap, the papers they had gathered over the past week stacked neatly before them like a fragile bulwark against the chaos that Karen had unleashed. Across the room, Karen leaned toward her attorney, whispering with the same bright energy she had displayed on Anna's porch, her scarf arranged carefully around her shoulders, her hair styled in loose curls that gave the impression of effortless grace. To anyone who did not know better, she looked like a woman, simply seeking fairness, a neighbor wronged, and Anna could see from the faces of those who had gathered to observe, some local residents, others simply curious, that many were already inclined to sympathize with her. When the judge entered, a silence fell that was sharp and expectant. Proceedings began with Karen's attorney presenting her case, laying out the so-called easement documents, the petition signed by neighbors, and financial statements showing supposed losses from being denied access to the porch. The language was crafted to suggest legitimacy, each phrase designed to sound reasonable, but beneath the polish Anna could hear the hollow clang of falsehood. Karen herself took the stand, her voice trembling at calculated moments as she described how she had only wanted to bring joy to the street, how Anna had screamed at her and torn down her posters, how the community had been deprived of a gathering place because of one woman's selfishness. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders shaking, and several spectators murmured softly in sympathy. Anna felt her nails bite into her palms as she forced herself to remain still, reminding herself that outrage was precisely what Karen wanted to provoke. Then came Martin's turn, and the atmosphere shifted. He began with the architectural plans Daniel had drawn, pointing out the official seals and signatures that left no doubt the porch was built as part of a private residence. He presented mortgage records, tax filings, and photographs spanning years, each showing the porch as integral to the home and never designated for communal use. Finally, he placed the alleged easement on the overhead projector, enlarging the shaky lines of Daniel's forged signature. With deliberate care, he explained the inconsistencies, the identical pressure marks, the digital replication of ink, the date format impossible for that decade. An expert witness, a retired architect who had once worked with Daniel, confirmed that not only was the signature false, but the entire document bore hallmarks of recent fabrication. The expert's calm, precise testimony carried a weight that Karen's theatrics could not match, and Anna felt for the first time that the tide was turning. The decisive blow came unexpectedly. As Martin concluded, he revealed records obtained from the county clerk showing that Karen had submitted similar forged documents in previous disputes, attempting to claim partial rights to a neighbor's side yard and later to a strip of land bordering another property. Those cases had been quietly dismissed before reaching trial, but the pattern was undeniable. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he reviewed the files, and then asked Karen directly whether she had prepared the documents herself. For the first time, Karen's composure cracked. She stammered, glanced at her attorney, then forced a brittle laugh, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that she had trusted the wrong notary, that people were conspiring against her. But the more she spoke, the more transparent her desperation became, and the spectators who had once looked on with sympathy began to exchange doubtful glances. Anna did not allow herself to feel triumph. Instead, she sat very still, watching as the performance unraveled, as the woman who had invaded her life with such confidence now flailed beneath the weight of exposure. The judge spoke firmly, declaring the easement invalid, condemning the use of fraudulent documents, and issuing an order that barred Karen from approaching or using Anna's property in any capacity. He went further, referring the matter for potential criminal investigation, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. Karen's face blanched, her scarf slipping slightly from her shoulders as though even her carefully constructed appearance could no longer hold together. As the gavel struck, Anna exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding, a release so profound it left her trembling. The porch was hers again, not because of papers or witnesses, but because truth had finally cut through the web of lies. Yet the victory felt more solemn than joyous. She thought of Daniel, of the years they had built together, and of how close his legacy had come to being tainted by forgery and greed. Walking out of the courtroom, the damp spring air cool against her skin, she knew the battle had ended in law, but that its echoes would linger in memory. Still, for the first time in months, she felt the faint stirrings of peace, a fragile certainty that she had defended not only her home, but the life she and Daniel had once shared upon that porch, the sanctuary restored at last. The house felt different when Anna returned from court, though nothing in its walls had changed. It was as if the silence, once heavy with fear and uncertainty, had lightened, the air no longer thick with intrusion. She stepped onto the porch slowly, almost reverently, her hand brushing the railing as if to reassure herself it was real, still hers, untouched at last. The boards creaked beneath her shoes with the familiar sound she had once cherished, and for the first time in many months she allowed herself to sit again in the wicker chair with her coffee, not as a defendant or target, but simply as the woman who belonged there. The street was quiet that morning, a few neighbors walking dogs or trimming hedges, and though some avoided her gaze, others offered tentative nods, as if unsure how to acknowledge what had passed. She did not need their apologies. She needed only the stillness of this moment, the restoration of what had been nearly stolen. Karen, she learned through whispers, had retreated into her own house, blinds drawn, her once loud voice absent from the street. The flyers were gone, the makeshift stand dismantled, the neighbors who once lingered around her now avoiding her altogether. Some spoke of the criminal investigation still pending, others of how quickly admiration had turned to suspicion, but Anna did not dwell on it. The ruin Karen faced was of her own making, and Anna felt no triumph in it, only a quiet distance, as though Karen belonged to another world entirely, one governed by performance and manipulation. As the days passed, Anna began to reclaim her porch not through defense but through quiet acts of presence. She polished the railing where nails had scarred the wood, replanted flowers in pots that had been knocked askew, and invited a few close neighbors for tea, not to prove anything, but simply to share the space on her own terms. sitting there with the soft murmur of conversation, the laughter subdued and genuine. She realized the porch had never been about exclusion or inclusion, but about memory and belonging, a bridge between the life she had lived with Daniel and the life she continued to build alone. For the first time, she felt that Bridge could carry her forward. The conflict had left marks, on Wood, on reputation, on her sense of safety, but it had also revealed a resilience she had not known she carried. As she watched the sunset spill across the porch one evening, painting the boards in gold and shadow, Anna understood that defending this space had been more than a fight for property. It had been a fight for the right to hold on to her past without surrendering her present, a fight she had won not by shouting but by enduring, by standing firm when truth was tested. The porch was hers, still, and with it the quiet certainty that she would never again doubt the strength that had carried her through.